No, I'm very. What are they? I don't know. They don't speak to me.
You know, same. That's my program is in Japan.
You know where he's, is he based at?
I have no idea. Yeah, it's be up here. Actually, we can see, employees. I was just up here real quick. Easy to.
Yeah, I'll be right back. Okay. That would be great. If then I got room to see them. At one of the universities. And I was like, you know what? How are you?
Anonymous. Another one.
I hope it's gonna go again.
How was your weekend?
Yeah. Trying to major theory.
Keep sweating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen you
Yeah, something like
in
that.
a long time. Yeah. Yesterday because of the storm and Riley traveled. Era last night. That's not bad. I'm frustrated.
It's too much in my closet.
This whole day. Didn't even do like.
Susan's like.
Well,
Yeah, I'm right.
You're good.
Just like, so that's just spaghetti.
Yeah, and I'd forgotten she was.
oh, she was nice to see.
Oh, really? Fun thing to get back to.
This is fun too.
Yeah.
Raymond, when'd you get back?
We have to bring it.
Yesterday.
How are you guys doing?
Yeah, I'm kind of dying right now.
Yeah.
It's also part of the ISP program.
It's not-
Band-Aid off.
Yeah, I know.
I'm happy to see some.
Fantastic. And so I've heard. I'm a houseman.
I think you gotta go.
Long.
Yeah.
Uh,
Your house.
Yeah, I would,
Well, I
we're,
mean,
we're
different
saying
levels.
in the meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jenny, you just go, wait, it's Jennifer.
But this is. Introduce myself. Yeah, only.
What was in the door being back?
Here, yeah.
And then like.
I didn't fall into the trap that I was in, like, it was not very
After the game, it has to bring the relation.
for general in Africa.
Yeah.
I'm glad I
And
was.
she called me Renata
Yeah.
for 2 years. Went to her meeting. And then I just became Renata, right? So, and then like.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, God.
I want to speak so much every time when I feel like speaking.
How dare you?
Yeah, yeah, it's like keep engaged.
You don't correct.
I appreciate your attention.
This allows for the administration.
You can start about 5 after. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes here. I want to say that there are many frustrating moments being an academic, but there are some rewarding ones as well. And one of those rewarding moments is if you look and you get your author's copies come in a box and you actually hold the game first time. And I had that moment half an hour ago.
Heavy.
He got the special lead insert.
All right. And you are ready to go.
remarks. So let's start at the beginning. In political science, we tend to have a more narrow understanding of technology as a set of material capabilities related doctrine resulting in technology having a relatively fixed meaning. An aircraft carrier is just an aircraft carrier. However, I turned to science technology studies to generate a thicker understanding of technology. STS is an interdisciplinary field of study that explores the linkage between scientific knowledge, technology, and society. In this tradition, technology is conceptualized as consisting both of the material and the non-material elements behind technology. And technological development is seen as continuous and can go into many different directions. So if we go back to our aircraft carriers, what a carrier looks like and how it's supposed to be used can vary dramatically, all the way from light carriers to carrier strike group. And so indeed, using a more thick understanding of technology allows me to observe variation, the variation that exists in states to military tools, both across countries and across time within one country. And so to capture this variation in states' weapon systems, I've created a novel typology of weapons postures. And this builds on the work of people that from this department, particularly Vipin Narang and Fiona Cunningham. And so I define weapons posture as a set of newly designed or repurposed technologies and related equipment, the practices of use, and the technology's role within the state's military apparatus. So basically what the postures come down to is how the states precisely decide to build a technology, what they intend to do with it, and how they want to integrate it into their overarching arsenal. And so in doing so, they can design these postures around newly designed or repurposed technology. And so the unit of analysis here is a category of weapon systems like missile defense, aircraft carriers, armored vehicles, and the weapons postures are situated at the national level. In making these choices, it is not the amount of military capabilities that matter, but rather their orientation. So I identify four types of postures, four types of ideal types in some ways among these weapons postures, each representing a decreasing amount of force that a state threatens, prepares for, or actually intends to employ. So let's go through them. The first one is a hegemonic posture, which revolves around developing capabilities that can threaten or inflict force anywhere, anytime. So in missile defense, this translates to moving the core elements of the missile defense system into space, thus representing a form of ultimate control. The space-based X-ray lasers that were part of the Strategic Defense Initiative is an example here. Then we have a strategic posture. A strategic posture requires the development of capabilities that can strike at the heart of the adversary's interests, including its leadership, economic infrastructure, and population. So in missile defense, this corresponds to national missile defense. These are systems designed to protect the homeland, and an example here is the United States ground-based mid-course defense system. In a tactical posture, the capabilities are much more contained in scope and aim. Here, one pursues the type of capabilities that can detect and destroy an adversary's military capabilities while ensuring that it can withstand counterattacks. So in the missile defense realm, this would be integrated air and missile defense, which consists of a set of diverse, flexible, and integrated capabilities to combat an adversary in the theater of warfare. And so an example is the US Army's IAMD system that is currently in development. And then finally, a control posture revolves around developing capabilities that can remove limited obstacles in order to enable one's forces to conduct military operations or to deny hostile forces access. In the role of missile defense, this corresponds to theater missile defenses designed to address relatively unsophisticated ballistic missiles within the theater of warfare. And an example here is the British Sea Viper. So it's important to note that these categories are not technologically deterministic. Contrary to, for example, the offense-defense literature, I contend that a posture can be built around different technologies. So if you want to build a homeland missile defense system, you could do it through the GMD system, but you could also do it by putting a ton of Aegis ships around the coast of the United States. So having shown you now that we can think about weapon systems in these four categories that can vary between countries and within one country over time, Let's now think about what's causing this. So within the study of military innovation, one could identify a key variable across the main approaches to explain why states' military capabilities differ, and that's external threat. Structural realists believe that the buildup of military capabilities is a rational response to threats posed by the adversary within the international system. While still assuming that threat is the driving factors, others within the military innovation literature contend that the causal chain between threat on one hand and the outcome, the military innovation on the other hand, can be distorted by a number of variables. So in the case of state capacity arguments, the amount of financial resources, organizational capabilities, or technological means that a state has can disrupt the linkage between external threat and military technology. In the case of organizational and bureaucratic theory, intra and inter-organizational dynamics, bureaucratic procedures, and interest group politics are put forward as disruptive factors. And then finally, for cultural theories, a set of norms and traditions at the state level or within organizations could shape what technology ends up looking like. But what each of these theories tend to overlook is that decisions about the development of weapon systems are taken in the context of profound and incalculable uncertainty about the future. This means that decisions about the construction of a state's military arsenal are not flawed due to imperfect information or misperception. Instead, the decision to develop a novel military capability is made many years before a war is in sight, at a time when decision makers do not know who the adversary will be. States do not even know whether the equipment that they envision building will work and whether it will be appropriate to face those challenges. So I argue that this creates two forms of contingency. First, under conditions of deep epistemic uncertainty, states and the domestic players within those states might not necessarily know what their interests are, nor how to pursue them. And then second, it creates contingency within the decision-making process itself. So in sum, taking the future seriously and embracing it as a space of deep epistemic uncertainty undermines the causal chain that students of military innovation have set up. And so while social scientists have long accepted that history matters, I argue that the future matters too. The future is a deeply political space. In it, actors imagine possible future states of the world, they visualize causal relationships, and they reflect upon how their actions could influence future outcomes. And all of these reflections, I argue, impact decision makers, actors' decision-making in the present. As the future is unknown, it is also a space of deep contestation. Actors within the broader defense community, so members of the armed services, members of the legislative and executive branch, the industry, the expert community, can have radically different or competing understandings of the future of warfare. And so my argument starts with domestic actors' ideas about the future of warfare, which I call images of warfare. Actors will then bargain over these ideas, attempting to form a coalition around them and to access the state's decision-making nodes with their ideas. So let's unpack the causal chain here a little bit more. So first, the images of warfare are bundles of ideas about what warfare will look like in the future and how states plan to fight it. So the images of warfare consist of two elements. The first one is the impressions that actors have of the future security environment. And then the second is how they envision overcoming such adversary in that future conflict. And so in doing so, the images of warfare are not deterministically given by anarchy or the international system, nor are they entirely reducible to material self-interest or organizational preference. So the future environment captures actors' ideas about the nature of the adversary and the type of threat it poses. So I classify this as either envisioning a strong or a security environment with strong adversaries or one with weak adversaries. And so just to give you a famous example, here is a speech or a section of a speech of George W. Bush, in which he portrays states like Iraq, North Korea, and Iran as rogue states. These actors will develop missiles and they will use them to blackmail and rain terror on the United States. And so basically, this is the construction of a weak adversary. The theory of victory, meanwhile, is defined as an actor's ideas about the future, how the future adversary should be fought. And actors can imagine tackling that future warfare in a decisive or a non-decisive manner. And so here's another example, which is from an interview I did. And this interviewee portrays missile defense as only playing a secondary, non-decisive role in this envisioned combat situation. As an aside, I think this is quite interesting because there's a common assumption that policymakers always envision fighting the future in a decisive manner. But in reality, what my research finds is that there's actually individual variation over preferences in the theory of victory. So the images of warfare give rise to technological preferences among domestic actors. And so let's build this table with theoretical predictions together. So if an actor, a domestic actor, envisions a strong adversary and one that the actor wants to defeat in a decisive manner, then I expect them to prefer the type of technology that allows the state to tackle the adversary at every level of conflict in any geographical space and at any time. So this gets you to a hegemonic posture. So in missile defense, you need to be able to intercept missiles at different stages of their flight. You need to be able to intercept a very diverse set of missiles, and you have to do so while covering an incredibly wide area, and you need high levels of firepower in order to do so. And so this ultimately gets you to a desire for space-based missile defense. Imagining a security environment with a strong adversary, but wanting to defy that adversary in a non-decisive manner, I predict that actors will push for capabilities that allow the state to defeat an adversary's military capabilities. So the aim focus is winning the battle, if you will. And so this gets you to a tactical posture. And so in missile defense, this means that you need to be able to intercept a diverse set of missiles at different stages of their flight. And this is ultimately what integrated air missile defense is all about. If the actor thinks that the security environment, imagines a security environment with weak adversaries and want to combat them decisively, then such an actor will want a system that allows its state to strike at the heart of the adversary's interests. And so this will get you to a strategic posture. In missile defense, this means that you will need to have a good degree of geographical coverage. And it will also mean that you will need to be able to intercept multiple missiles. And so this translates to national missile defense. And then finally, if the domestic actor still envisions a security environment with weak adversaries, but wants to fight those adversaries in a non-decisive manner, then I predict that the actor wants the type of technology that enables it to overcome or to remove limited obstacles that the adversary has put in place. And so this is a control posture. And in missile defense, what we're really talking about is these relatively unsophisticated ballistic missiles that you can intercept, quote unquote, relatively easily. And this is what puts us in the realm of theater missile defense. So let's move one step further in the causal chain towards the box of ideational contestation. Ideas are mediated through power, which is something that's actually often overlooked by the ideational scholars. And so to better understand these dynamics, I draw on insights from the social movement literature. And more specifically, I contend that the domestic battle, and thus whose ideas ultimately win, is shaped by three interlinked factors. The first one, already mentioned, the novel ideas about the future of warfare. The second, coalition building, which is the ability of actors to build encompassing coalitions, but that include relevant veto players within the defense community, using mostly persuasion, but also sometimes a couple of side deals. And then third, state openness, which is the ability of actors to access key nodes of the decision-making process. So to bring all of this together, I have a fairly complicated graph, which starts with the fact that new ideas about the future, which are typically pushed for by an advocacy network, create an impetus within the state to look for policy solutions, thereby increasing the decision-making moments and spaces. These same ideas also constitute a resource for missile defense advocates to start building this encompassing coalition within the broader defense community. And then ultimately, the ability of the advocates to build an encompassing coalition and have its actors be able to access the key nodes of decision-making within the state are the two necessary conditions for a coalition to translate its preferences into one of the four weapons postures. However, there's an important interaction effect. The bigger your coalition gets, the easier it is to access a state, Likewise, the more access you have to the state, the easier it is to build your coalition. And so just to bring everything together, if my theory is correct, I would argue that we need to see three different things. First, we should see variation in weapons postures across time and space. Second, we should see different sets of ideas, both in terms of the images of warfare and the associated technological preferences within the domestic debate. And third, we should see evidence of actors bargaining over their ideas, attempting to form these coalitions and access the state with them. So that was a whole lot of theory. Now, let's get into the research design. So for my book project, which is still very much ongoing, so I'm very excited to hear your feedback in a minute. I do comparative case studies in which I compare and contrast the development of weapon systems across different countries and across different times within one country. And so the development of missile defense is the core case here. And so I trace the development of these capabilities in the United States, France, the United Kingdom from 1980 until 2020. I'm also considering extending the case into India, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A. And then I also include some examples from air power in the war period and aircraft carriers in the post-World War II period in those same states. So why did I select these cases? These were key technology cases in periods when the international system was in flux, and so there was more uncertainty with regard to that future adversary that I'm talking about. Okay, so to gather all the data to construct these cases, I did archival research and interviews. And I would argue that archives and interviews are the ideal way to test this type of argument. It allows me to examine the range of ideas that were voiced at the time, how people were talking about these ideas and which ideas were disregarded. It also enables me to find evidence of coalitions that were formed around these ideas, how these coalitions attempted to get to the state, and the level of openness of the state's relevant decision-making bodies. And then finally, it allows me to link or to trace the linkage towards the outcome in terms of planned or actual military capabilities. And so concretely, I did 103 semi-structured interviews with members of the defense community. And so here you can see a distribution per country and per role. And so I did these interviews between spring 2019 and spring 2023. This for me was a silver lining of the pandemic, which is that all these policymakers all of a sudden had time to talk to me. And these interviews typically lasted 1 to 2 hours. And so I asked participants for their perspective on missile defense and their role in key missile defense decisions. And just to give you a sense, interviewees included national security advisors, principals in the Department of Defense and State, members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, members of Parliament, and the physicists and engineers who actually worked on these programs. And then I also visited 17 different archives in the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, where I've collected what is currently a massive mountain of relevant documents. And you can see all the archives I visited on the map here. Documents include meeting notes from the National Security Council, internal memos and reports, correspondence back and forth between key figures in this debate, strategy documents from groups inside and outside the government, just to name a few. And just to give you a tidbit, the last big archives I got access to was Ronald Rumsfeld's personal papers in the Library of Congress. I don't know if anybody here in this room has seen them, but they're phenomenal. And they contained 2 boxes on the discussions about missile defense during the campaign of George W. Bush, which is incredibly informative. So here you can see what the variation in the missile defense case looks like. So this table basically captures all the different shifts in missile defense postures by dependent variable across the 3 countries. And don't worry, this is a busy slide. I'll come back to it in a little bit and take you through it. So having to explain to you how I went about doing this research, let's delve into one of the cases. And so in this case, I'm going to study or explore how we got to the Strategic Defense Initiative, sometimes dubbed Star Wars. This program was famous for its technological infeasibility, exuberant cost, and massive impact on the relationship with the Soviet Union and the US allies. So to set the stage, on March 23rd, 1983, a moment we probably all remember or learned about in my case, President Ronald Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative. He proposed several futuristic technologies as part of a space-based missile defense system or hegemonic posture. This included space-based X-ray lasers, particle beam weapons, plasma weapons, advanced computer systems, and an array of sensors. This is often portrayed as President Reagan's personal journey of learning about nuclear weapons. In July 1979, he went to visit NORAD, the organization in charge of defending the US homeland against nuclear attack. There, he asked General James Hill, the commander of the facility, what NORAD could do in terms of protecting an American city against an incoming Soviet ICBM. And the general replied, "We can't stop it." According to popular narrative, this is where Reagan's idea of defending the US against nuclear weapons was born. However, I would argue that this story could not be further from the truth. And as I will show you in the next few slides, the true origins of Reagan's SDI speech were much more political, the result of a large shift in images of warfare in the mid-1970s, manufactured by a well-organized network of conservative activists, principal among them the Committee on the Present Danger. So in the middle of the 1970s, a number of individuals and organizations started to push back against the politics of the détente. The détente was characterized by the acceptance of a stable relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, centered around nuclear deterrence through massive assured retaliation. Missile defense had no role to play in the strategic relationship, as outlined in the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Dissatisfied with these ideas, a group of activists, foremost among them included former Paul Nitze, a former Deputy Secretary of Defense, and Eugene Rostow, a former Undersecretary of State. They brought together a group of like-minded policymakers and strategists, and they named their group Committee on the Present Danger. The aim of this group, as explained in their manifesto, was to warn the nation about the growing Soviet threat. And so the list of participants quickly grew. They had more than 170 members within a year, many of whom had held prominent positions in government, military, and academia, and they constitute what I would call an insider advocacy group. They behave like a typical civil society group. They're trying to grow their membership. They want to educate the public. They're very concerned about influencing policy, but they're actually made up by very powerful insiders. And so in fact, even Reagan himself was a board member of the organization before he became president. And so on the left, you can see a picture of the organization's early efforts to approach him. And then on the right is a letter from when he became president that he wrote to the CPD, arguing or telling them how much he benefited from the work of the CPD. And so these activists promoted the idea that in the near future, the Soviet Union would become vastly superior in terms of military capabilities and would thus pose an existential threat to the United States. And so overall, they portrayed the future security environment as facing a strong adversary. At the same time, they advocated for a decisive theory of victory. Rather than abiding by the rules of nuclear deterrence through massive mutually assured destruction, these activists advocated for a theory of victory that revolved around fighting and prevailing in nuclear war. And so this was encouraged by the fact that they thought that the Soviet Union would be doing exactly the same thing. Many of the CPD members entered into the Reagan transition team and the Reagan administration. And you can see a list from the New York Times here, and also have the archival membership records. A lot of the language in official documents started to mimic the CPD's ideas. So the 1982 National Security Strategy, for example, describes the growth of the Soviet military power as a core problem for the United States. And so similar language can be found in numerous internal memos and meeting notes in the Reagan archives, and there really was a heightened sense of threat at the time. Similar dynamics can be observed with regard to the theory of victory. For example, this National Security Directive stated that the goal of the United States is, and I quote, to deny the Soviet Union a military victory at any level of conflict. And interestingly, this is linked to very particular ideas about the effect of nuclear war. So for example, T.K. Jones, who was at the time the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, said that the United States could recover from an all-out nuclear war with the Soviet Union in just 2 to 4 years.
With enough shovels.
Adopted by the Reagan administration, these ideas created a high level of openness for missile defense advocates to push through their ideas about space-based missile defenses. This shift in the images of warfare was truly a necessary condition. At the turn of the decade, we see three distinct groups of missile defense advocates coming to the forefront, each with their own proposal for missile defenses, but all centered around this idea of developing a system that could intercept a large barrage of sophisticated Soviet ICBMs in a decisive manner. And so the first one is Senator Wallop and his aide Angela Cordeville, who apparently used to be in my department that I'm at the U now. And we're developing, are talking about lasers and specifically chemical lasers. Then there was Daniel O'Graham, who was a general in the US Army, and he proposed an unmanned battle station armed with kinetic kill vehicles or guided projectiles. And then most famously, or infamously, there was Edward Teller and other members of the Lawrence Livermore Lab who proposed a nuclear pumped X-ray laser. The idea was to put a number of lasers around the nuclear device in space. And so during an attack, the nuclear device would be detonating, thereby creating enough power for the lasers to destroy incoming missiles. And so what we're truly talking about is nuclear explosions in space. So the missile defense advocates obtained the support of Carl Bentenson, who was a conservative businessman, as well as President Reagan's unofficial advisors, which are sometimes referred to as the official cabinet. They merged their efforts into a coalition called High Frontier. And so after some internal conflict within the group, they put all of their weight behind Teller's proposal. This group was incredibly effective in advocating for their ideas, as they had really close ties to the Reagan White House. And so in doing so, there are multiple meetings between them and the White House science advisor, George Hebert, with key advisors to the president and with the president himself. I found a lot of letters between the president and members of this group. Not everyone agreed with these space-based missile defense proposals. When George Shultz was informed a few days before the SDI speech, he lamented that this would change the strategic view and doctrine of the United States. Similarly, as explained by Frank Miller, various members inside the Department of Defense opposed the idea. And even in the lab where Teller worked, there were scientists who disagreed with the proposal. And then finally, in the words of the head of the Missile Defense Division at Lockheed Martin at the time, these people were just consumed with space. Notwithstanding significant opposition, the missile defense advocates were able to convince another very powerful group or veto player within the domestic sphere, and these were the Joint Chiefs. Though the Joint Chiefs weren't really enthusiastic about the prospect of missile defense, they were very keen on saving this missile, the MX missile program. And the MX missile program was a massive ICBM capable of carrying 10 independently targeted warheads, but the missile was vulnerable to attack from the Soviets. And so with missile defense, so the space-based missile defense advocates argued, the MX missile could be protected against Soviet attack. And so with the Joint Chiefs on board, missile defense advocates had built a truly diverse and broad coalition, and hence the Strategic Defense Initiative was born. So quickly zooming out to the broader book project, today we've talked a whole lot about the theory, which is representing chapter 2. And then I've given you a little bit from chapter 4, which traces the development of missile defense policy in the United States from the 1980s until the mid-1990s. And so I promise to come back to this slide, just to briefly look at the other missile defense cases. The hegemonic posture established by the Reagan administration lasted until 1993, even though the Soviet Union had already fallen apart by that time. This changed in 1993 when another set of actors pushed through an image of warfare centered around threats from weak adversaries with small to medium range missiles that would be fought in a non-decisive manner. And so this gave rise to a control posture. A few years later, a network of conservative activists pushed back, arguing that the United States was facing a weak adversary in the form of the United States that needed to be dealt with in a decisive manner. And this is where we get to a strategic posture and a ground-based mid-course defense system. We see another major change in 2016, when we get a novel image around the need to fight Russia and China as potential strong adversaries. But we see two different coalitions developing at the time within the broader defense community, one pushing for a decisive, the other for a non-decisive theory of victory. And this has ultimately resulted in a rift that we see very much today in official policy between tactical and a return to a hegemonic posture. The French case, meanwhile, demonstrated that ideas, US perceptions about the future of warfare could travel to another country, but I think it's quite unlikely for them to take hold in some ways. The experimentation with national missile defense programs in France from 2008 to 2015, I argue, is a consequence of French policymakers adopting the language of a threat from Iran, which they argued could be resolved with missile defense rather than their almost sacred nuclear deterrent. And the UK case, finally, is a dog that didn't bark. There was huge pressure on the UK to invest in these capabilities due to the US-UK special relationship and with the UK being a NATO member. And while there were missile defense advocates in the UK throughout this entire period, these advocates were almost never able to form a coalition needed to push through policies until 2015, when they finally adopted a theater missile defense policy. And I'd be happy to talk more about any of these moments of change and stability. And then I also use some examples from field air, but the interwar period and aircraft carriers in the post-World War II period to demonstrate generalizability of my argument. And then just wrapping up, to conclude, my research has, I hope, convinced you that there are three important insights for debates in international relations. First, I've adopted a broader view of technology, one that incorporates both material and non-material aspects of technology and sees technological development as continuous, non-linear, and multidirectional. And so as a result, I can observe previously underexplored variation within and between a state's military arsenal, which I captured through this concept of weapons postures. Second, I have hopefully demonstrated to you the importance of ideas and narratives and imagination as key variables to explain why states develop different capabilities. And in doing so, I've shown that these are primary variables and not some kind of intervening variable. And third, I have argued that we need to focus on the messy process of colonization. In doing so, I've put forward three ways or three elements for thinking about that. One is the power of ideas. The second is the formation of these inter-bargaining coalitions. And the third is state openness. And so as a result, what I've hopefully gotten to is kind of a different conceptualization of policy change. So rather than thinking of intra or inter-institutional bargaining, I've opted for a more dynamic understanding of the decision-making process and one that can travel to all these very different contexts that we study, whether it's the United States, Europe, or India. So I want to thank you very much for listening, and I'm really excited to hear all your questions.
Thanks, Summer. So we do have quite a bit of expertise in the room on nuclear weapons. So I'm going to start with our Stanton nuclear fellow, and give them the first questions if you have them. Yeah, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Roger. Thank you, Sana. This was so interesting. My work also deals with military innovation to some extent, although I focus mainly on when arms control comes into
Sarah,
play.
you
But
want to stand up so we can hear
sure,
you?
sorry. Anyway, I'm Sarah Biggood. It was really a pleasure to hear your comments. My question was about the relationship between sort of the images of war and the technologies that states adopt to address them. I have a chapter in my dissertation that looks at Reagan, so I'm very fascinated by his views about nuclear weapons. And one of the things that has come through for me is that, he was really afraid of nuclear war, and part of SDI was to render missiles, impotent and obsolete and all of this kind of stuff. And so I'm wondering in your research if you found that, policymakers need to have a uniform vision of war sort of across the state and what the future of warfare will look like, and ideas about how to address that in order for a technology to be adopted or to complete the innovation process, or whether you could have, the Committee on Present Danger in one camp, feeling like we need to be victorious in a nuclear war, Ronald Reagan in the other, who's hell-bent on avoiding one and is very afraid of one, but they arrive at the same conclusions about the utility of something like missile defense. And I guess if I can add on a secondary question, in my own research, one of the things that's really come through for me is the importance of kind of institutional or individual advocates who get excited about a technological imperative. And it almost seems to me like those people are sometimes shopping around a cool new technology to find people who might feel like it suits their needs or suits their ideas about a future threat environment. So I wonder where those kinds of institutional advocates fit into your causal chain. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll take the first ones one at a time.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you, Sarah, and it's very nice to meet you. So those are great questions. So I would actually argue, even though, I guess I would answer the question a couple of ways. First, the figure of Reagan.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he's a hard figure to understand
Yes.
in many ways, and there's like great historical debates, history debates about what he was and what he was not. I would very much come down to the fact that I think he was very steeped in the logic of the CPC, and many of these actually, even if he was scared of them, did come from this very hawkish understanding of what the security environment was like. And so when he came into office, he opened the door for people who really had these ideas, and he himself, I think, had a lot of those ideas as well. And so for that, then missile defense becomes the right answer. And I also so in the archives, one of the arguments you often make is that SDI was a way to stave off the nuclear freeze movement. I didn't find any evidence of that. So I looked through the nuclear freeze records, and I don't know if you have any experience there, but it would be helpful to hear what you found. But I didn't find any reference. Those were two separate discussions. And so, my theory does not say that there needs to be a per se uniform. Individuals have different ideas and different notions, and things can conflict. So that we see in the figure of Reagan. So I think that doesn't per se preclude the theory that I'm talking about, because it's really about ideas and not per se about like internal beliefs and contradictions that people have. The other bit that I also want to bring out is like, a lot of these coalitions are about persuading other people that we are facing a strong threat from the Soviet Union, that the only way to deal with the Soviet Union is by fighting them head on. And so a lot of that is persuasion, but there's also some horse trading. So famously, in 1991, when we are in the global precision against limited strike phase, Ambassador Cooper, who's the head of the Strategic Defense Initiative organization at the time, he wants to get the military services involved, because the military services really don't like missile defense. So very strategic move on his part. He goes to the Navy, he convinces a couple of people in the Navy, a couple of pretty big shots, and he says, like, really, this is something the Navy should care about. We just went through the Gulf War. The Navy has the seas, you can build an underlayer for this grand space-based missile defense system that I'm like trying to build. The Navy leadership, the CNO at the time, really wasn't on board with that. But then Cooper said, if you can build it, or if you can help us build it, we'll pay for it, right? So we do see a little bit of side dealing in this as well. But I would argue the more a coalition is built around these side deals, the quicker it will fall apart. And then finally, the in-tech imperative, I think some people are like kind of enamored by technological development. I think that is true for some of the really big advocates. I don't think that explains why other people get on board and come into a coalition. So I'd say that as necessary but insufficient variable to explain this. If that answers your question, it's perfect. Thank you.
Thomas.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. I mean, I heard it more than once, so I don't know if there questions. But I do have one actually. It's about your slide and your theory of images of warfare. You're focused on how they imagine the enemy in war specifically. But on one of your slides, there was this interesting quote that these people were consumed by space. And I wondered it was something about also the way they imagined the future of mankind more generally. It made me think about all these escapism now that you see with Elon Musk going to space and this sort of thing. So I wonder whether you integrate those in your theory and how they would fit, and whether you do deem them relevant.
I think I'd say two things, and thank you for that question. I think I'd say two things. So one is an observation about imagination. So it's kind of interesting that a lot of people, when they're thinking about the future, which we're all doing, we're all constantly making projections about the future, but the majority of the people I look at somehow do not get much further than what already exists. And then some other people like go out there and like think about and have ideas about the most crazy stuff ever, right? Like really far out. And so there is a way in which these space-based missile defense advocates had really grand ideas. And there are other scholars who look kind of at the relationship, for example, between those ideas and notions of space or notions of even science fiction. I'm thinking about Aaron Bateman's work, for example. And I think I have it a little bit as side notes here and there, but it's not like super central, but it is an interesting linkage that other folks have explored. Thank you.
James, you're on the list of
Yeah, thank you.
fellows I'm given.
Happy to steal
Yeah.
the order. I'm James. Nice to meet you again. Thank you so much for an incredible presentation. I really like the ideation approach that you presented. And I'm personally curious about, in terms of the images of war that you presented. So there were the theory of victory and the perception of security environment. So I'm curious if you have thought about why like certain people have different kinds of different perception of future and different perception of theory of victory in the first place. I think that could also affect what's the outcome that is predicted from your theory. So that's my first one. If I can add like small second question, as a stand-in fellow, I'll be curious if your theory could be applied to the procurement of nuclear weapons. I know you have focused on the missile defense, but I can possibly see if that can be also a good predictor of what countries, like when do they try to acquire nuclear weapons and also vertical proliferation.
Thank you very much for the questions. So to address the first one, why do people have such different beliefs? I think that is our ideas about the future of warfare. I think that is a phenomenal and important question. Unfortunately, my book is already massive, and I'm currently trying to fit everything I have in 100,000 words, which is a nightmare. So I am not addressing that question in the book. But I do, however, have another project with a co-author, Dan Post. We're in early stages, but we're developing a survey to specifically get at people's deterrence beliefs. As a function of this and why people's deterrence beliefs vary, which is interestingly an underexplored question in the survey literature. So I have other work that kind of gets at that. And sorry for the unsatisfactory answer. There's tidbits in the interview I've done that like maybe give us some insight, and I've got some stories and chapters with no systematic theorizing. So hopefully that will help the other projects. And likewise, I think these theories are indeed applicable to nuclear weapons as well. And this is like kind of a little pet peeve of mine, but we've created like a conventional weapon community over here and a nuclear weapon community over there. And we're all talking about weapons procurement, but somehow we're not really, our theories aren't actually coming across. And so one of the things I want to do in the next project, in the next big project, once this is finished, is to really think deeply about the linkages between nuclear and conventional weapons, of which missile defense is such a great example. So sorry, these are very unsatisfactory answers, but.
Well, I think James's work, partly, if I can just say, is that it's a step before yours where he's saying the personal experience of some of the decision makers is going to affect their imagination. Is that right, James?
That's what I was personally thinking, but
Yeah.
So Linda, do you want to come in on this or not? Yeah.
Thanks so much. I found your presentation super interesting. I have two small questions. My first question is whether you, in your coalitions and that kind of part of your theory, whether there's a difference between coming up with something new, we have nothing, let's do missile defense, and we are doing missile defense in this way, and now we're going to do it in another way because you have like some sort of a sunk cost and all kinds of bureaucratic things. So like how you're whether your theory somehow makes a distinction between these two phases. And then I was also wondering whether your theory, but maybe this falls outside of the scope of it, your ideas about ideas are still very strategic in the sense of like, this is what we want to do and this is what we're going to develop. But it seems to me also with like nuclear weapons, sometimes it's also that like something exists, what can we do with it? Right? That it also sometimes goes in the other direction. So I wonder whether what could you potentially tell me about the other direction, or I mean, to the extent that that also somehow like fits into this, that your theory about the future is based upon what exists, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for an excellent question, Linda, and a fellow Belgian in the room. So on the first part, whether if something already exists and it's changed, whether it is different. So I don't really think at a theoretical level it is, because the mechanisms are still the same. We need a novel image of warfare to emerge. Then coalitions will use that novel image to build a coalition. Then it will create these access points, which then the coalition will try to access and change. And I think in nature, this also comes down to the fact that, and this is part of the language that I adopt from science technology studies about that actually technology changes a lot over time. And these technologies, even when they're already here, they become part of these different postures. So if we go for a concrete example to my favorite piece of technology of all times, which is the Aegis ballistic missile defense ship, the Aegis ship has massively changed, right? Like it started out as an air defense ship. Then in the 1990s, it gets this theater ballistic missile defense function. They both invest in a theater-wide program, which is like what later becomes what is now somewhat the SM2 and the SM6, so that's a very rocky story. And then the SM3, which is the upper tier program. And what you see is during the Clinton administration, it was really hard to get funding for our upper tier program because the entire missile defense policy was geared towards this control posture, towards theater missile defenses and not towards upper tier defenses. Then when we come into Bush wants to build the ground-based mid-course defense system, wants to build national missile defense. Aegis has no role to play in that. So there's attempts within the administration time to cut the programs. And the reason why the SM3 program survives is because it was co-developed with the Japanese, and the Japanese were like, hey, we're investing in this too, you can't just cut this program. But as taking a step back from that, what they did end up using the Aegis program for, interestingly, was they use it as a radar for the first GMD test because they didn't have radars to be able to do that at the time. And then when we go into the Obama administration, which is really a moment where they're deepening the national missile defense structure, then they come up with this idea of just basically putting the top part of the Aegis ship and putting it on land in Romania and Poland, which I don't know if you've seen pictures, it looks kind of funny. But this is like, so in that way, it becomes part of this regional homeland missile defense structure. And then when we fast forward now in this moment where we're in between both a tactical posture and a hegemonic posture, we see that this ship again takes on another role. So on one hand, we see massive investments in signal processing and really being able to integrate different aspects of the ship. So both like the SM2 and the SM6 and the SM3, but also the air defense functions and being able to run those missions simultaneously, which is apparently really hard to do. And then the other bit, which is that we saw the SM3 Block 2A used against an ICBM type target, and thus back to this whole idea of underlayers where we started with in the 1990s. So the technology and what technology is and what it can and what it cannot do changes as these grand ideas are molded into postures, and then these existing programs become repurposed and become different things, if that makes sense. And that's really the story that I'm interested in telling, and that's a story I think that sometimes in political science we don't always see because we've got more rigid measures of what technology is. And that was a very long explanation to the other one, which is reverse causation. So is it that there's already something and we might be imagining on the basis of that? So I would actually say that images are really often prior to things that happen, both in terms of capabilities, but also in terms of events. Like if we look at the Gulf War, which is this major important moment in the development of missile defense, wherever you set in terms of your images determines how you interpret the Gulf War. So when I did interviews with policymakers, I always asked them to recount what the major milestones in missile defense development were. And so everybody will bring up the Gulf War. But depending on where you sit in this debate, you will have an entirely different interpretation of what that Gulf War meant. If you're into theater missile defense stuff, you'll tell like, hey, US troops were under fire by these like Soviet, by these Scud missiles, and that was very dangerous and we need things to address it. If you're on the national missile defense or beyond vision of the world, then you're like, no, what really the Gulf War meant is that Israel could have been drawn into the war and then it would have strategic implications and that would have been real bad. So this is what really missile defense is all about. It's at the strategic level, not at the theater level. Anyway, I think this is like, so this is like these ideas are really shaping how they're interpreting events, but also how they're interpreting existing technologies. And like these ideas and these images all coexist at the same time. There's always advocates for each of these four different visions of the future of warfare, but they can't always build a coalition. Therefore, in order to do so, you need these large shifts in the images of warfare, which truly are prior. Like a good moment here would be like in 1995 when the Republicans put national missile defense on the campaign as like the top thing on the campaign. It didn't work. Because the shift in images of warfare hadn't happened. It was in 1998 Rumsfeld Commission, and everything that came out of that truly shifted ideas and that then opened up space to build coalitions and to repurpose technology. I hope that was a satisfactory answer.
Daniel, do you have a direct follow-up on this?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Daniel Siebel, I'm a second year PhD student. So just sort of trying to square what you said in that last, answer the last question, what you said in your presentation. Like you're saying that technology is deterministic of these categories, right? But then seemingly you were saying, well, the reason why we don't use Aegis to do homeland missile defense is there's things GMD can do that Aegis can't, right? So like I'm a bit confused then about whether technology is deterministic or is it not. And this relates to it in another question I have about how you're categorizing hegemonic and strategic. So on your slide, you say hegemonic is strike anywhere, strike anytime. And then we were talking in your case about SDI, it's always in the context of Reagan's scared about the Soviets. There's a Soviet, Soviet. That doesn't seem to be hegemonic, right? There's one clear adversary that they're trying to target in this program. So if you could just talk through a little bit about why SDI is hegemonic rather than strategic, and then provide some clarification on how you're doing these sort of categories.
Okay. Daniel, thank you very much for your questions and the great questions. So the first one on technological determinism, this is where we go back to the way you could do homeland missile defense is through the GMB, which is what we currently have. But the other way to do it would be to put a bunch of Aegis ships around the coast of the United States and have them do interception. And that's actually whether it's fully realistic or not, right? This is where missile defense, like a lot of the stuff actually isn't doing what's supposed to do, isn't functioning effectively. I mean, the questions of technological feasibility, I'm leaving out of the scope of the postures, but there were proposals. For example, in 1995, the Heritage Foundation did a massive study on missile defense, and their proposal was to put Aegis ships alongside the coast of the United States. And so that I think to me proves that these things can really fluctuate, and you can build up these postures with different sets of types of capabilities. And then the difference between hegemonic and strategic, I mean, fighting the Soviet Union is one adversary, yes, but it's an adversary they're fighting across the globe, and they're fighting the adversary with very complicated, high sophisticated ballistic missiles and different types of missile threats, which I think puts it fairly and squarely in the hegemonic category. The strategic is actually much more limited, I would say, but this is unsatisfactory, I think. Right, let me try again.
Well, just because you say strategic is supposed to be like an adversaries like national interests, right? SDI was aimed at the Soviets' national interests, not everyone else in the world's national interest or every country's national interest, right? There's one clear threat there for that program. So that seems to be.
But I think, yeah, I think that's good pushback. I think the difference is that the hegemonic posture, the aim is to be able to rule the commons or rule the command, and the aim of the strategic posture is to undermine the adversary's will to fight. And the question in the Soviet Union was not just undermining its will to fight, it was much more about that. It was struggle over who's ruling the world, if that puts that in plain, stupid language. But maybe that doesn't go into, I'll think more about it. Thank you.
Charles Glazer, I think you want to follow up on this?
Just a different question.
We have a different question? Okay, we'll go ahead. I'll call on him.
Well, thanks for your talk. Good to see you again. This brings back memories because much of my early work in the 80s was.
Charlie, can you stand up and?
Just to date myself a little bit. So I had a couple questions. It seems to me that in some ways the key comparisons would actually be within postures. Because so much of what a country wants to do or needs to do it is in some sense about the set of missions it chooses. And it's not a wide open, I mean, you're just not gonna, a small country that doesn't face a global threat doesn't pick a hegemonic posture, I mean, et cetera. So I would think that a lot of the variation you want to explain would be with countries, let's say, that want to do national missile defense and that they pick different systems or something like that. So I don't see a lot of explanatory value across the category, across the postures. Or is there, that's a big thing to explain, but I mean, second, even though I'm putting these categories, all these materials categories, I'm into ideas that matter a lot, so I wouldn't dispute that. It might be interesting if, I know you don't have space, but I mean, there was a big debate in the United States before the ABM treaty. I mean, there was a lot of enthusiasm for missile defense throughout the 50s and 60s. And then some group won that debate, partly for ideational reasons and partly for material type reasons. And then you get the Reagan administration. So in some ways, that's a useful comparison because it's actually a national missile defense, and I would call it national, I would put it in pretty much in strategic in both categories, but in any event, they're very similar. And that seems to me like a more straight up comparison. And then having said that, material things matter a lot. Your title is procurement politics, but none of those exotic technologies from SDI were procured. They were researched. And some of them weren't researched for very long because within a couple of years, you could show that they didn't make any sense. So SDI is sort of really the early 80s and mid 80s and the Reagan administration are just a very weird, I mean, they're like it's like a great argument for the extreme potential of ideas, except then they go nowhere, which suggests that they also have like pretty limited, I mean, so like there's lots of potential and then pretty limited potential in a capable system. So I don't know quite where that gets you in terms of your argument, but these guys were dreaming. I mean, they had technology ideas, but anybody who was careful, including, Ash Carter did some of the very early important work, it didn't take long. It was just wasn't possible. So I sort of wonder where the material constraints on the ideas are. The United States has basically now deployed a very small or medium-sized ground-based system that is sort of a natural follow-on to the 1960s systems. That's it in terms of homeland defense. So I think that maybe it should be part of your story somehow.
Thanks, Ron.
Yes, so thank you very much for those great thoughts, Charlie. Just to answer, so one on the variation within postures. So yeah, I mean, I'm really kind of interested in how these are rearranged, but I can get back onto that. But the ABM treaty in the 1950s and 1960s, I actually do write in the precursor to this chapter, I write a little bit about the background of that discussion because it is important to understand where and why we get to things in the, first of all, why we have MAD and how all of that is arranged and the role of missile defense into it, and then how the Reagan administration pushes back against that. So I do that. I also am writing another paper on and I think you've seen that paper on the eternal promise of missile defense and why missile defense ideas are so attractive. And here I'm actually explicitly comparing the ABM precursors to the ABM treaty and kind of the factors that led to the treaty with the Obama administration's pursuit of missile defense. In terms of whether SDI, overall, I think missile defense is in my book, a really good test case for the role of ideas, because missile defense is this space where they're building and they're pouring massive amounts of money into systems that are beyond the bounds of any technological feasibility, that keep incurring a lot of problems, and still all of this stuff keeps going. And so I think that's a great test case for ideas in some ways, maybe in some ways an easy test case for ideas. And this is separate from whether these postures, one of the things I do look at is this, I look at postures when they're decided to be constructed or to be planned or built when there's money invested in them, not whether they actually exist, because in missile defense stuff doesn't always exist. So in that sense, I would say it's like a little bit different. Anyway, so I've got elements of both in there. I would say that SDI SDI was weird. It's a weird period of time. It's really out there. I mean, but it had really long-lasting effects, right? Like it lasted until 1993. Until 1993, they were investing in a lot of this stuff. It overcame the end of the Cold War. It overcame a shift in presidents. Like that means a lot. And I think also that a lot of the systems that we have today are systems that come out of that SDI periods. They're not we don't have the space-based X-ray lasers, but there is still investment in directed energy, and directed energy investment has been going up again in the last few years in the labs. And so I think we're very much still dealing with the fallout of SDI today, and all these programs are still with us because there was such an impetus in funding in the SDI period, even if they have now morphed into entirely different things, which is exactly what the project is trying to explain, is how all of these systems are continuously morphing, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. Barry Posen.
So you have a pretty sweeping and kind of complicated argument. And I was trying to sort of summarize what I might pull out of it, but I'm not sure it's what you intend me to. And of course, I lived through this period of my formative years in this business. So literally, I was in Brooklyn, across the street from the offices of the committee. We used to make jokes about the committee twice a day, at morning and coffee. Jokes that became to regret, I mind you, because of the story that you tell. So it seems to me that ideas about technology are really not that important in your argument. The central theme that I recall from the time, often made in technological and weapons system terms, was an argument about the nature of the adversary. That the committee succeeded in changing the image of the adversary to an adversary that was incredibly aggressive, incredibly risk accepting, and incredibly cost accepting. And that the only way to deter this adversary was through the threat to annihilate it, and annihilate it in a way that was pristine to ourselves. That's what it would take, right? And every bit of evidence about Soviet weapons programs and their behaviors was interpreted this way. And you know, at the time, as a young person, I found it kind of breathtaking, you know, in part because they didn't seem that different from the Soviets of 8, 10, 15 years ago, but these guys succeeded in peddling. They were incredibly energetic, which is one of the things. And second, they just had a lot of mouthpieces, right? So I'm wondering, what do you make of that argument? And then, you know, the thinking, putting this in the context of my old friend Steve Van Ever, who talks about cults of the offensive and this notion that the necessary is possible, right? So all of this had to work because it was necessary. It's possible because it's necessary. Charlie points out, within a couple of years, we found out that most of this was not possible. But there's a second part of your story, which I would summarize in a different way, which is after gluing all of this stuff together in programs and institutions and monies and businesses, we began to figure out what was possible. You've built an interest group, right? You've built some. So the possible becomes necessary. And every screwy theory that they come up with afterwards about what BMD is going to be for is just about tailoring the objective to what the capabilities might actually be, right? So part one of your argument is really, it is a kind of a structural argument, but it's your ideas about the enemy, right? So it fits with you. But the flip side is a very material argument and a very bureaucratic argument, right? And once you turn something on in the United States, it's bloody hard to turn it on. So what would you say to that characterization of your argument?
So I think you're spot on. And I think this is like kind of the complicated part of what I'm trying to do, which is I'm trying both to tell an ideational story and a bargaining story, because both are the key pieces you need to understand. If you are in the ideational literature, they will not talk as much about these advocacy groups and these coalitions and the way they seize power. And it's really marrying both, which is an ideational and somewhat of a material story that gets us to why we see a program like SDI, why we get to the ground-based mid-course defense system. So I wouldn't at all disagree with your characterization, but like if you just are going to talk about the material interest, like it's not interest group, because these are things that transcend organizational interests, and these are coalitions that don't follow how these organizations are structured. They're coalitions that are built above these organizations, and so are not bound by these organizational interests. But you still need for these coalitions to work and to do their thing, you still need ideas. Ideas is the money in the situation. And these ideas are incredibly powerful. And they really, like the amount of people that become enamored with the CPD ideas is insane. Like it's really crazy, because at the end of the day, like even at the time, you could prove that a lot of that stuff wasn't at all true, right? Like one of the most recent things I've been doing is I've copied all these meeting notes from the archives, from the Hoover archives, where the CPD records are, of their annual meetings, where it's just like big booklets where they're talking to each other about how big and bad the Soviet Union is. And like those conversations are mind-boggling, right? But Anyway, I think that your characterization is very much on there in terms of like thinking about the importance of both these ideas and these coalitions. And it's really, I think, and there's also like, I think one of the things I want to bring out in the book that isn't necessarily upfront in the theory, but it's kind of the way in which these coalitions get echoes. So you get the 1970s CPD. It's not the first CPD. We had a CPD before that in the 50s and the 60s, but this is 1970 CPD. But we see the exact same tactics come back in 1995. And it's the same people. Like Rumsfeld, like all those folks, they were already hanging out at the CPD. They were already in the Reagan administration. They already knew these strategies. And then they re-employ these strategies against Nash to start talking about the woke state threat. For example, like the Rumsfeld Commission, I mean, there's so much mimicking of the techniques that were used in Team B that come back in Rumsfeld in even a smarter way, I think, in some ways, because of getting the more dovish, three dovish like Garvin, the other two people on the committee, and getting them to agree what was ultimately like the idea that rogue states were going to develop along ICBM style technologies within 5 years, and the whole world was going to be on fire, right? Like, anyway. So I think that part really, and I think where the power of ideas about the future lies is exactly what you said. It makes the possible probable. And that's what ideas about the future can do, because they're somewhat amorphous. You can create enormous amounts of pressure to them. And that's ultimately why these ideas are important. I think I'm rambling a teeny tiny bit. In terms of they have the technology and then they're just reinventing other strategic reasons for it. I think this is where the coalitions that emerge later on to push for other forms of missile defense, I think they're often different people. They're not the same people. I mean, some of these people sometimes are similar, but sometimes also move on. So I think a good example of that is when I looked at the Bush records in the campaign in the Rumsfeld papers. What was really surprising was that a lot of the old SDI fighters, they came back. And that I didn't know that's not in public information, but they were in the background writing all these memos and emails, and they were advocating through a form of like what was again some space-based missile defense stuff. And there was a space commission set up, but those ideas couldn't go anywhere because they didn't fit with the image of warfare at the time, which was these rogue states and the threats that the rogue states posed that was ultimately adopted in the Bush administration. So it was a disjunction. So even if they stick around, does that make sense?
I know what you're saying, but now you're kind of shifting to a threat-based argument, which is what you kind of rejected.
Yeah, but the difference between, I would say, a more realist threat-based argument versus the one I'm making is that realists would argue that there's kind of an objective way to think about the threat environment. Mine is that it's all these ideas that are constructed that you that it doesn't necessarily align with what's actually going on, right? Like ideas of the third state, which is what is the precursor of the rogue state, actually already started during the Bush administration before the Soviet Union fell apart. There were people in the Bush administration that were pushing these different narratives already. They didn't come out until much later, but so the world really at that point was still fighting a Cold War, right? So what I would argue is that these threat perceptions are constructed. They're purposefully constructed. They're not necessarily, and they sometimes coincide with what actually happens in the world, but a lot of times they also don't. So it's just not just a matter of perception and misperception. It's a matter of construction.
You're still, I mean, I don't want to take up the air in the room. You're still constructing. You're kind of conceding that you can't construct something out of whole cloth. So you're stuck with the problem of trying to weigh the relationship between ideas about the future and the facts you have to work with in crafting ideas about it. You couldn't, you probably could craft a global threat of asteroids as a BNG argument, right? But it's not probably a great argument, right? But so whether it's rogues or whether it's the Sovs, or whether it's the Chinese, you gotta start with something.
Yeah.
Right? It seems like you have to start with something, and then you end up with a disagreement about the characterization of the something. And those who wish to characterize the something in the most threatening way often win. Now, the question is, do they win just because they have louder mouths? Because people are naturally frightened? Because the bad guys have given you enough to work with? Or is it a random thing in your theory?
No, they win because they are really good, not always, but for example, in the CPD and in the 1995 instance, they're really good at building that coalition. They have extremely good advocacy tools. And like, if you look at the CPD records, I mean, it's phenomenal. They're like constantly discussing about, okay, so we have to go talk to this Congress member, and we have to like build our leadership, our membership, and we got to reach out to these folks, and we got to go on TV. Like, they're tracking the amount of TV performances they have and radio performances. So I think there's something to the way that they're actually some of these advocacy networks are really, really good at building kind of building support around these ideas.
I'd like to bring one of our practitioners so we get some reality here. So Nate Padgett, who is our military fellow, and he gave a talk during our interim period. All our military fellows have to give a talk, and he gave a talk on Air Force aircraft carriers, how up in the sky and crazy ideas. I mean, going back to Zeppelins, putting airplanes on Zeppelins and that. So you've been thinking about ideas and the constraints on putting those ideas into practice, Nate. You're listening to the talk here and how you're putting it together, and you're talking about how some of these ideas are possible, but you have to get past the Air Force resistance to have unmanned vehicles because of that. So anyway, you want to have some comments on what you heard?
Yeah, I had a separate question. We can go down that road though. But thank you for your talk. So yeah, I mean, my question, I'll dovetail them together. But so your causal story is this IVDV relationship of kind of the ideas and images of warfare, intrastate driving procurement. I'm curious then how you detangle the effects of alliances, and specifically in this case, since you were looking at a couple of European countries of like the US nuclear umbrella, obviously might interact with I think it was the UK that had no missile policy for however many decades. But then along with kind of what Roger's talking about as far as that you can have these ideas and these strategies that can get implemented or be advocated for at a senior level, but if they don't mesh with kind of doctrine and the available technology, that's going to die on the vine as well, because it's something that the bureaucracies are resistant to change, and you're going to have some sort of driving factor that's really going to force that, which in peacetime is generally this kind of looming threat type fear.
Thank you, and very nice to meet you, Nathan. I'd love to learn more about your work on UAVs. So in terms of alliances, so the one thing that my theory doesn't specifically, it's really a domestic politics story, so it doesn't take into account as much of the alliance stuff, except for that it can be an input for missile defense. So the NATO is putting huge pressure on the different European allies to invest in missile defense capabilities. But what those missile defense capabilities end up looking like is still a function of national decision making. And so in the internal dynamics that I'm talking about. And so in the UK, for example, I mean, even though there was huge pressure on the UK and you get missile defense ethics, even all the way up to Blair himself, who is very supportive of some of the things that were coming out of the Bush administration, you don't actually get a missile defense policy because they can't get the military on board. And they can, the first time they get the military on board is in 2015, when the Royal Navy redefines its mission around the world. And this comes to your question of doctrine, when it redefines its mission as back to an east of Suez strategy. And all of a sudden, if you're going to go east of Suez, you might need capabilities for doing that. And all of a sudden, this missile defense thing becomes attractive. And so they get on board with the proposal. Ultimately, they end up with the Sea Viper, which really in reality, and this is where, again, this thing doesn't align with actual operational realities, like the Sea Viper is not going to help you in the South China Sea because it doesn't have the capabilities to do anything meaningful there. But still, right, this is where we end up in terms of like that created an opening to finally get a missile defense system investments.
Okay, Chicago.
From Chicago with you, I'm a visiting fellow here. Fascinating talk, thank you very much. Fascinated also because I've been doing research in threat perception formation of the similar period, so I have a few questions. And one is the future. What is the time frame? Because my research found that people have different lengths of future. So when you talk about the future, you know, security environment, are they the same? Are you sort of defining it as like 10 years, or does everybody have different ideas? Two is the role of coalition. In your SDI story, the coalition was very forceful. My finding is not always. It doesn't really does good role in flipping people's threat perception. It helps when they already have that. So I'm wondering whether it was successful because they were able to influence the leadership, because when the leadership has these different kind of threat perception, it does get things moving. So is it the story that they were able to influence Reagan, therefore it was influential? Medium presentation, they tried to imitate something like that around 2000, like the project of New American Century. They often use the same language, but I would argue they weren't as successful as your CDI, SDI story, CPD rather. So is it more to do with the leadership? Because Rumsfeld was there, President Bush had certain ideas, neoconservatives. And also, I think you're depicting a period where everybody almost agreed that it was the Soviet who is the primary threat. So you didn't have to convince others of Soviet is the bad one, right? It's just a degree of how much was necessary. Whereas in the 1990s story, it wasn't as clear. I'm wondering how this group of coalition who are pushing the missile defense, did they have to push for a new threat and a new idea, or just sort of tailor, this is a useful one, so we could use this for that as well. So I'm wondering whether the function and the role of the coalition, influence the coalition differs. And it was only when it was successful to getting access to the leader who already is sympathetic to that kind of idea. So those are my questions. Thank you.
We'll quickly do that one, then we'll collect the last set of questions.
Okay, fantastic. This is such a phenomenal discussion. Thank you very much, everyone. So thank you for your question, Chicago. Yes, it is exactly the fact that the images of warfare need to come first, and those changes need to happen before missile defense advocates can actually come in and push for missile defense. Interestingly, for example, there is CPD communication between the leadership of the CPD and missile defense advocates like Teller, who are asking the CPD to take up missile defense as one of their advocacy points. And they go like, nah, you know what? These systems are crazy. We don't believe in them. There's other things we should invest in first and not in crazy missile defense. So it's actually really interesting because it creates space between these images of warfare and the missile defense advocates. So those weren't necessarily the same part of the same instance, but the images of warfare shift was necessary for the missile defense advocates to come in. And so another really interesting instance of that is in the UK. So in the 1980s, Thatcher and Reagan start talking about missile defense, SDI. Initially, Thatcher goes like, hey, this SDI stuff is like kind of, we don't like this. It doesn't fit with how we're thinking about the world, which is, yes, there's a Soviet threat, but we are focused on nuclear deterrence, and missile defense has no role to play in that. So she initially goes to Camp David. They get 5 points worked out, whereby they're going to try to limit Reagan's dream somehow from the outside. But over the course of those conversations, Thatcher becomes incredibly enamored with these threat perceptions that are uttered by the Reagan administration and missile defense as a solution. But even as a head of state and as someone who is enamored by it, she actually doesn't manage, because there's conversations it's as part of UK participation, FDI. There's even conversations about building maybe a program for the UK itself. And this is what Thatcher is ultimately interested in. But the MOD and the FCO are like, nope, absolutely not, because this doesn't fit with our worldview at all. And so there's this really interesting back and forth where the MOD and the FCO keep writing memos to Thatcher about how bad all of those ideas are, and then Thatcher excluding them from meetings because they're being hard asses on her. So anyway, it's a fantastic story. Anyway, the threat perceptions need to come first before you move on to missile defense preferences. On the threat environment, the other bit that I want to mention is this is why I'm really interested in doing the Indian case, which is one of the casualties, COVID casualties of my dissertation research, which is I was supposed to go to India right when the pandemic ends. But the reason I want to go to India is because they are facing two very different adversaries, Pakistan and China. And so I want to understand how people in the missile defense world and the broader defense community are balancing those two things and how that influences missile defense decisions. So more to come on that.
Okay, we're about out of time, but I'll just give people one rapid fire question for those on the list. Starting with Phil Hahn, who flew A-10s and believed that A-10s should be part of our Cessna weapons pod. And then, Right, you had a question. Can you keep it to one question? And then Kunal and Ron, and then quickly, one question each, and you can pick or choose among them.
So several of my questions were asked, which is good. I had a question about selecting on a DV. So these type of innovations are relatively rare. I at one point went and looked at them to find out they don't actually happen very often, right? And so the examples you have are exceptions. So does your theory, can I use your theory to help explain why it doesn't happen? In other words, the absence of ideas or coalition building or state openness, should I find those as variables to help me explain why this stuff doesn't happen? I think you talked a little bit about with the UK case, because that was going to be my other question, which I like to look at dogs that don't bark and understand why it doesn't happen.
Right. So I'm actually asking a question on behalf of Sam Leiter, who's in Tokyo and watching over the live stream. So his question is, so in your theory, is the image of war that wins out in this contestation, is it the one with the most convincing and active advocates, or is there something else that determines which image comes out on top?
Thank you, Senator, for a great talk. Lucas Hellermeyer from Berlin, Germany. My question goes to the allies and the European cases. So why do something on their own for the French and British cases? So why not buy into something existing American, especially for the British ones? Why? I mean, they're using the Aster missiles, which the French are also using. It's called Sea Viper, but it's the same missile. So why do something on their own?
No.
Thank you. So this was about the slide that you had about the timeline and the different strategies that states have selected during the. So I was wondering what would be the prediction of structural realism, which you reject initially. So in for those time periods, and if they are same or different, and if they end up being same, and the difference is only that there is an objective view of the world versus a constructed view of the world. So it might help you possibly by not rejecting structuralism, but rejecting maybe theory of nuclear revolution.
Yeah, Westwood.
Okay, well, two very, very fast comments.
Okay.
One is, if I remember correctly, the nuclear freeze proposal came after or at the same time as SDI. And second, if somebody's shooting at Chicago, Aegis ships are going to be.
All right, take your pick and
Okay.
whatever you want to say.
I can go for one, so I'll go for the scope conditions question. So I think that's what you're after, which is scope conditions of my theory. So I think that the three scope conditions for my theory are that it's about weapons technologies. So I'm not interested in infrastructure or any other support technologies. They're not really part of what I'm trying to explain. They have to be changes in the conduct of warfare per all the literature that's coming out right now, like the Horowitz and Pinnick article and what. And then finally, I think there are innovations that require a significant amount of buy-in from different members of the community. And so, for example, if we think about Nina Coller's article on the trucks, like, I don't think that would really fit with my theory. But beyond that, I think my theory hopefully can explain also a lot of other things around military innovation decision making. And maybe even, I mean, and this is maybe a little wishful thinking, but hopefully the way that I think about ideas and bureaucracies and decision making can also have a little bit of relevance beyond military innovation space and give us a little bit more tools to think about how national security decision making is happening.
All right, we're past the hour, and I want to thank somebody, especially with some of these ideas like threats are constructed, to come into a bastion of challenge some of our thinking, and you'll never convince the old people in the room, but you might some of the younger ones. I appreciate you being here. So let's thank our speaker. Could have been coming yet, so. I
Yeah, I did, you know.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.